don't see on.
Okay, we'll give them one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully he'll join us soon. I'll go ahead and text him. All right, so Commissioner, similar to last time, what we'd like to do is get through the full presentation, so you can just jot down your questions. There's Commissioner Jones. You can just jot down your questions and comments, and then we'll, depending on how long the presentation takes to get through, right into questions and comments. So with that, those of you who are watching, welcome to our budget session. So we'll start this off with our city manager, and I know he has a number of other folks who will also be presenting. So city manager, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon again, commissioners. Thank you for your patience. You should have received a packet with the slides, as well as I think our CFO email questions that have been asked since the last presentation. And you should have that in your inbox from any questions from last week or the week before that we had not already responded to. So I will begin, and I want to begin with my appreciation to the staff for all the work that they've done to put the materials together. And hopefully you will find it helpful and informative as we go through not only the proposal, but the recommended amendments that we believe that we should make in order to ensure that we have a sustainable and balanced budget. So if someone can pull up the slides for me, please. And if you could, what we'll try to do is brief through the materials as quickly as possible, similar to last week, and then reserve the balance of the time for the commission to either discuss or ask questions of staff. Next slide. So this, again, shows the schedule where we are. We have one more week of budget discussions. This will be the last week in which we brief on the sections of our strategic priority. We have another session next week prior to the public hearing that evening. And again, hopefully we will be able to adopt the budget on the 21st. Next slide. So today we want to go through the remaining three sections of our strategic priorities, the engaged and connected community. There's a lot of questions around our community survey last week, so we'll talk about that a little bit more today. We'll talk about government excellence. We're also committed to discuss some of the workforce issues that we have been managing, along with the economic halt that has occurred due to the pandemic. And we are looking forward to giving you a progress report on where we are on some of those issues, as well as other things that helps us in maintaining good governmental services. And then lastly, as we discuss health and environment, we'll hear a little from our Stormwater Oversight Commission, a brief report from them, and then we'll go into some detail on our LED lighting plan, as well as our park and recreation update. Next slide. The sound is really bad right now. Oh, it's on. Okay. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
It sounds
okay. Why don't you pick up the next slide? Let's go to the next slide. How about now? Still can't hear? Okay. Molly, why don't you pick up and brief this slide? If you can hear me, then just turn it over to Doug.
There's city manager.
Perfect. We can hear you perfectly now, city manager.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I think you just have to move back a little bit, city manager.
Okay, what about now?
Yeah, I think it's okay if you're back a little bit more. That's good.
The door was open too, so I just closed the door, so maybe that helped.
Yeah, that's better. Okay.
And we put some foil paper on the antenna as well to make sure there was. Okay, the revenue reductions, we had identified we needed about $9.4 million in additional revenue reductions as in addition to the $13 million reductions that we have proposed. Last week, we shared a plan to reduce about $8 million in additional expenditures. And so we have about another $1.4 million to close the gap, and we will do that, share those recommendations today. Next slide. So I'll turn it over to Assistant City Manager Matthews to take us through the investments by strategic priority.
Okay, so we're going to follow the same format that we did last week. We're going to take a look at the dashboard metrics, some of the community survey results, and key accomplishments. Then we'll go back over some of the proposed investments that came forward in the preliminary plan, balanced, of course, by the recommended reductions that we're looking at based on the new financial reality. You know, a lot of folks have referred to the new normal. I've been trying to think of it as the next normal. I think we're going to go through a number of iterations of what we define as normal over the next year. So we'll start with engaged and connected community. Here you'll see a couple of the key dashboard metrics that we've been tracking in terms of resident view of the quality of service that's provided by the city, as well as the percentage of residents that believe the city does an excellent or good job welcoming city involvement. And we'll see a little bit more detail on some of those survey results as we move our way through this. So one of the big questions that we added to the survey, we wanted to link it back to the strategic plan itself and get an idea from respondents of which aspects of the strategic plan were most important to them. Ensuring people that feel safe and are safe was clearly the most important of all of the strategic priorities, followed by investing in healthy communities and natural environment. And then it was really a focus on education, enrichment, and financial growth for our residents. So if you look a little deeper in the details, and you'll see this throughout when we talk about engaged and connected, both aspects of the community writ large and in aspects of the city specifically, the ratings were consistently higher overall than they were with most of our minority respondents. So here you see we've got the ratings based on the characteristics of the community. So that's not just the city, but it's the lowercase city as opposed to the uppercase city. People who live here feel like 65% felt excellent or good about opportunities to participate in community matters, and 47% felt positive about openness and acceptance towards people of diverse backgrounds. You see that those numbers are lower with our African American population. And when you look at the openness and acceptance score, it was pretty significantly lower with the Latinx population. So here we're looking more at the city specifically. So our own community outreach and engagement activities, as well as our job welcoming resident involvement. Again, you'll see that those scores are generally higher in the general response than they are with our minority and ethnic responses. So looking at key accomplishments, the neighborhood activities that we've had, so that includes the Neighborhood Match Fund, the Neighborhood Summit, and of course, some of the other activity that's being run out of our Equity and Engagement Office has been a positive development and continues to grow in popularity. When you look at the Neighborhood Match Fund in particular, the number of responses that we had when we focused that fund on COVID-19 support and resiliency efforts was pretty remarkable. Of course, in this last year, we brought forward the Task Force on Elected Representation, and want to bring that back to you all with some summary information. So hopefully we can talk about whether or not there's some decisions we want to make going into November this year. We've been able to increase our presence across all of our social platforms and really leverage our technologies to be able to engage. And we started establishing a more comprehensive and robust language access strategy. You've seen that with not only the Spanish live stream and the commission meetings, but also the interpretation that we've made available for those meetings. And we want to continue to be thoughtful and intentional about that. In terms of our campaigns, we continue with our census and our lead awareness campaigns. Our completion rate through yesterday, and that's for self-reporting, was 64.7%. I believe when we looked at it yesterday, our total self-reporting in 2010 was about 68%. So we're well on track, especially given that the self-reporting deadline has been pushed back to October 31st. We just have to continue to push that message out, leverage our partners, and make sure that people are getting their responses in. Joel's done a lot of good work in terms of consolidating and making polling stations more available, as well as making absentee voting more available. And that was really reflected in this most recent election. The community-wide survey, of course, which is something that we've been talking about throughout our presentations on the budget. And this last one, I felt it was important to note, one of the things, one of the unexpected things when you have a crisis or an emergency like this is you have an opportunity to accelerate some of the plans that maybe you already had in place. And just like we're having this meeting digitally right now, we've talked a lot about increasing our use of online and digital engagement tools as part of the full suite of engagement that we do. And we've had an opportunity to do that through our current experience and really refine those tools to some degree so that we can carry them forward even when we get back to whatever that next normal is. When we look at our investments from a communication standpoint, that continues to be an area we know is a priority. The language access, not only did we carry forward that contract, but we actually increased the contract to be able to accommodate more of our activities. General support for Office of Communications, which included being more intentional in our multicultural and Spanish language capacity as an office. We are GR, continuing not just to move that forward, but to think about how we can best leverage it. Then our City Academy and continuing to invest not just in our own cable television capacity, but through the PEG funding, we also support our community access and educational stations. For community engagement, we talked about when the community survey was approved last year, we talked about doing that every other year and then using the intervening years to do focused inward surveys based on what we learned. From our discussion last week, clearly we want to take a step back, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Continuing to develop and implement our citywide engagement framework was a priority. And then continuing to invest in literacy programs. So Cook and the mobile library were initiatives that are advanced by the library system. And Storytime was something that we started last summer, which the library system had agreed to take over and lead going into this summer. Elevating resident voice, we talked about the neighborhood programs. I did not mention the neighborhood association support. And we also have the neighborhood connectors and the community ambassadors, which are really two components of using our neighborhood social capacity to be able to advance our engagement initiatives. And those are things that we want to be able to continue to do. And of course, we want to continue to invest in our voter education and make sure that folks are able to have their voice heard. So looking at the survey, as I mentioned, our original intent was to use each intervening year to do more focused on the ground conversations and data gathering that could inform our decision making based on what we heard in the citywide survey. We know that we still need to be informed by what we learned in that survey, but we also know that things have changed pretty significantly. So we're going to go back and we're going to work with some of our local partners to identify a methodology that can kind of meet in the middle between doing the same thing that we did last year and doing what we had originally intended to do this year. And we don't know quite what that's going to look like yet, but that's one of the priorities that we've got right now is pulling those folks together and talking about how we can best do that. I also mentioned the some of the unexpected, I don't want to say they're benefits, but unexpected outcomes of a response like this. And one of those was we were able to get a digital engagement system started up ahead of our original schedule. So you may have noticed that in some of our engagement activities, we've been receiving comments and questions via text and SMS. That's one of the aspects of this new engagement system, which we believe helps to lower some of the barriers to entry for people who want to participate. We've got a number of folks that effectively have the keys to the car to that system now. Some of the people that traditionally have done in-person engagement so that they can start working within the system and figure out how they can leverage the digital engagement, not to replace necessarily in-person engagement in the long term, but to complement it and to give people options to engage where they don't have to be in a specific place or time to be able to do it, which we think is really important. One of the other aspects of the new system is it allows you to do targeted promotion and surveying using social advertising tools. So in that respect, it's similar to the methodology that's been used through Elucid, for example. So we want to start testing that to see if we can use that kind of real-time inline surveying capability to be able to shore up maybe some of the things that we might be losing through that other program. So now let's look at some of the projected or proposed reductions. So we had about $50,000 that we needed to draw down out of the engaged and connected priority. And we're able to do that through a combination of reduced funding on some of our programs like our City Academy, some reduced community promotion. We don't anticipate that we're going to be doing as many events or the events are going to look the same as they are. So we will feel comfortable bringing that reduction forward. The communications contracts, I want to give credit to Amy and her team. They were able to reduce some of our contract costs without actually reducing the services that we were getting from those contracts. And then I know that Joel's been able to make some reductions in his budget as well, which I'm sure he can speak to if you have any questions. Moving on to governmental excellence. You have our key metrics here. You'll see the ones in green are ones where we're on our target. The ones in blue are ones that we're continuing to measure. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as we get into the survey results themselves. So focusing on resident feelings about the quality of our services, the direction of the city, overall customer service. For reporting purposes, these are reporting out as excellent or good. I think when we originally talked about them, it might have been excellent to fair. But for us to be able to effectively compare our African American and our Latinx respondents, we wanted to really zero in on the excellent and good categories. That's why these numbers might look a little different than what you've seen in the past. So 68% overall rated the quality of city services as excellent or good, and the direction of the city is excellent or good. On quality of services, those were lower amongst our minority populations. Direction the city is going, you'll see that, albeit a smaller sample, the Latinx respondents actually responded more positively than the general respondents overall. Then overall customer service, you'll see again, there's a gap there between the overall response and the response amongst our minority communities. So our accomplishments over the last year. You've heard us talk about this one. the healthcare savings has paid a significant dividend already. That's money we were able to save without making reductions, which would otherwise be on the table, and we'd be talking about more reductions. Completing the union contracts and being able to invest in employees. So when you talk about in totality, the change in terms of healthcare savings, which put more money in our employees' pockets, the employee contracts, which also had benefits and improvements to the medical plan, and then our ability to invest in both organizational development intentionally and in wellness intentionally. All of that is part of what we've been trying to do to better invest in our employees overall. Higher Reach, not only did we initiate that pilot, but a couple of months ago, we were able to take what we'd learned over the first few months, reconnect with the Higher Reach folks and start to tailor that program based on what we heard internally and what we were experiencing as an organization in terms of the I guess what you would say the overhead that the program was requiring in terms of implementation. And we feel confident that we can move something forward that's a little bit more appropriate to our needs and consistent with the intent of Higher Reach. We started implementing the initiatives that we brought forward this time last year in terms of the Third Ward Equity Fund. And we were able this year to continue to refine our equity analysis of budget submissions overall. It was, I think Stacy Stout would agree that it was a very open and informative process this year, both for the department heads and for the equity office to be fully engaged from the beginning of the budget process, to have conversations about the intended and in some cases possibly the unintended impacts of what was being brought forward from a budget standpoint. We developed the outline in terms of scoping for the master plan, not only launched our performance management system, but we started with this budget to really intentionally align the plan, the intended outcomes, and our budgeting a little bit more thoughtfully. We continue to press forward on our work in terms of data transparency and accessibility to city data. We're also working on a number of initiatives, not just to make the data available, but to make visualizations of that data more available and more accessible to the community writ large. Having a giant repository of data might be great for somebody that's working in an academic institution, but we want that data to mean something to anyone who lives here, and we want to be able to give them the tools to be able to do that. One of the priorities that I know that I came into at the beginning of this fiscal year was really taking a hard look at the security, not just of our buildings, but also of our digital infrastructure. And I want to thank you all for taking your cybersecurity training. I think that's only going to be more important. You've heard some of the stories through COVID-19 of people already trying to capitalize on that fear to fool people into giving up their information. From a facility standpoint, we've got to be just as thoughtful about how people access our buildings, our office spaces, because we need to make sure that we stay true to public accessibility, but at the same time, make sure that our employees feel safe coming to work. And then, of course, right there on the back porch, and hopefully we'll be able to celebrate around it sooner rather than later, we're able to complete the restoration of the Stabile. So our proposed investments going into this year, that included continuing our equity training initiatives, fully embedding equity in our Grand River restoration efforts. And that means equity in both contracting, but also in outcomes in terms of business opportunities that arise from that project. Transitioning the Indigent Defense Commission, and then really standing up and supporting employee resource groups. So those are employee groups within the organization to help empower our minority and our marginalized communities within the workforce, and to give them a platform by which to bring forward issues and initiatives that can help improve that environment for all of our employees. The big one on fiscal sustainability was an upgrade to the current financial management system. That remains something that we know we need to do, simply because the system that we have is pretty burdensome. And as we move through this process towards not just transparency, but also accountability and aligning budget with performance and doing a lot of the things that we've talked about through the strategic plan, we've got to have a system that can more effectively support that. The last one there is our investment in state and federal legislative support. So last year we approved a new state legislative contract. The federal contract is due for renewal this year. One of the things that we expected even before COVID hit was that we were going to have to make an additional investment when we went out to bid on that contract, and that's where that increase had come from. I mentioned a little bit about investing in employees earlier. That includes the pilot on higher reach, as well as our investments in wellness and organizational development. And if I can, I want to give a shout out to our wellness and our OD person, who have really stepped up and stood up and done a lot of remarkable things to continue to support our employees during this really extraordinary and unusual time. They've stepped into areas where we would expect them to, and they've stepped in some areas where maybe we wouldn't have expected them to. And they've really done a great job of helping the employees continue to feel connected and supported. And then the last one is really making more intentional investments in employee recognition activities. We talk about facilities and workspaces, continuing to invest in our facilities based on our asset management plan. And I mentioned the security enhancements in our public buildings. Again, unexpected opportunity that's come out of virtually everyone, not only say everyone, but such a high proportion of our workforce working from home, is that our facilities team has been able to go through the building and continue to make some of the security upgrades in terms of the badging and things that are going to make our buildings more secure for the employees. And they've been able to do that without active traffic in the buildings. And then we've got to continue with the decommissioning of some of our older facilities. Technology standpoint, general technology upgrades and enhancements. Something I'd like to mention there is that this year we restarted the IT steering committee and reconstituted it so that we have a little bit different representation on that group. I think in the past it was designed more as a budget control group than it was a strategic alignment group. And as we move forward in terms of technology investments, we want to be able to leverage that group of leaders to make sure that our investments are aligned not just with the budget, but also with the strategic plan. I already talked about the data analysis, the transparency work. That's something that Becky Jo and her team are taking a lead on. And then continuing to upgrade our parking facilities. Some of that has to do with business needs, and some of it has had to do with security needs, as we have more electronic payment options through our parking facilities. The last one there is upgrading our digital evidence storage in the police department. The last one on our list was our continued investment in the master plan. So now we look at the reductions. In terms of governmental excellence, we had a target of about $600,000 that we needed to draw down. And you'll see from this list that it really runs the gamut. There are some areas where we're keeping positions vacant. And there's a fair amount of trimming of contractual costs and operational costs where we could to be able to hit that target. Some of the, I want to say one of the other notable items here from the equity office is a significant proportion of their reduction was moving the employee equity training from general fund into one of our grant funds. And of course, those grant funds at some point expire. So we were able to make that reduction going into this year, but it's something that we're going to continue to have to keep an eye on as we move forward. So these are some of the personnel actions that we've already implemented. Right now, we did a quick calculation. We've got more than 200 full-time or temporary positions that are currently impacted. That includes about 150 temporary positions that either haven't been hired or have been reduced off the payroll, at least for the time, because they're not positions that we've needed. We've got 61 full-time vacancies that are frozen. Right now, that doesn't include uniform public safety. 7.8 FTEs, full-time equivalents there in the general fund. So while we have 61 vacancies frozen, if our target's the general fund, the number gets a little bit smaller. What'll happen over the year, though, is as vacancies come up, our goal is never that people leave the organization, but people always, at some point during the year, we have people leave the organization. Those are additional vacancies that we can capture and consider as they come forward. I mentioned the number that we've got on temporary staffing. I think our Parks Director is going to talk a little bit about some of his strategies later in the presentation. We went into this year having already reduced the temporary budget, not inclusive of library, by $208,000. Parks has already proposed a reduction in their own temporary staffing by $108,000. And police, you saw last week, is proposing to reduce the number of intern positions that they've got, which gives us another little over $150,000. That's one that we'll continue to look at and examine, because clearly we don't need to bring temporary employees on for roles or in positions or for services that we're just not going to be able to provide. So I want to emphasize on this slide the underline and the bold of if needed. These are all things that we've been doing some pretty deep analysis on. Right now, our commitment is to keep our current workforce whole as best we can, because it's our current workforce that is going to be providing services to our residents. Any reduction that we make in workforce, there's a necessary reduction in service level. And that's not a step that we feel like we need to take just yet. We feel pretty confident in what it is that we brought forward, but we need to have these in our pocket because we need to be ready to start making some additional changes if we see the landscape change significantly. So if we have more restrictive hiring freeze, that means everything stops exactly where it is right now. Based on the number of total vacancies that we've got, that's up to $8.3 million over 12 months. You'll see that some proposals are, let's keep something vacant for 6 months. And the current proposal doesn't include anybody that's in uniform. But if we needed to, that's the number that we'd be at. We look at additional reductions in temporary personnel and staffing, that's up to $7.3 million for 12 months. But I do want to make sure that we understand the caveat there, because we have a number of areas in the organization where temporary staffing is actually part of their business model. So when you consider 311, when you consider library, when you consider parking and parks, they actually have temporary personnel programmed in because their business is cyclical in nature. So none of these do we consider to be blanket options. You take it in, you walk away with whatever the saving is. We've got to be really thoughtful about how we might implement any of these. I know that some of you were in the conversation with the governor last week when the work share program came up, and that's something that we've looked at, and we've done a pretty deep analysis of the workforce to determine how we might be able to implement work share effectively with no net loss to the employee. So at this time, you've got participating in the work share program, you get a proportional percentage of the state benefit, and then there's the $600 federal benefit that goes along with that. We've analyzed our major components of our workforce to get an idea of what that would look like. And the potential savings is anywhere from $1.5 to $3 million through the end of the federal program. Now, it's important to note a couple of things on that. One, any participation in work share with a represented group requires concurrence of that represented group. So that's one of the pieces that we've got to think about, one of the pieces that we got to work through if it's something that we wanted to implement. The other is any reduction in hours, any reduction in staffing, as I mentioned before, is a reduction in services. And if we're ramping back up and we have to provide additional services to the community as we start to navigate our way out of this, we're not sure that we also want to be reducing the time that we have available to do that work at the same time, but it is something that we have on the table. From a broader perspective, when we talk about furlough and layoff strategies, our total payroll as an organization is a little over $400,000 a day. That's all inclusive, public safety, full-time, part-time, 700-hour employees. So that's the calculation then if you kind of do the math on a furlough. If you start drawing back, say, police and fire, then the number gets smaller. That's where the $239,000 number comes from. We have a couple of options when we talk about furloughs. One is a fixed length furlough, and that's what you've seen from some other government organizations, which is they've said for X amount of time, you're going to take time off unpaid, and then you're going to come back after that period of time. Another option is a rolling furlough. Rolling furlough is you reduce the number of hours, say, per month. So everybody takes 1 or 2 days off every month for a longer period of time. So you may capture the same number of days, you just capture it over a longer period of time. And then the last one is the straight layoff and workforce reduction. Last item I wanted to mention is early retirement. We've also run the numbers on that. So if we, and I'll just give this is the example that we ran it on. If we reduced temporarily, if we reduced the eligibility age from age 62 to age 60, we have 71 employees that would be eligible for early retirement under that scenario. Granted, that would also create a financial obligation for us to pay into the pension system for each year of eligibility that we shaved off. And my understanding is it would be 16% of whatever the total payroll was that chose to take that option. So that's $7.7 million across all operations, not strictly the general fund. And there would actually be an early retirement penalty we'd have to pay into the pension system on the back end of that based on the number of people who chose to take advantage of it. Okay, at this point, I want to pass it over to Mr. DeLong to talk about health and environment.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. We'll move right into it. So the dashboard metrics for health and environment, you can see that we're making good progress towards targets that are to be achieved by the end of fiscal 2023. We're measuring several of those targets, and we're also working on creating additional metrics, one of which would deal with lead levels that is under development. In terms of community survey highlights, you can see that 79% of respondents thought that our garbage collection service was excellent or good. And that varied a little bit for Latinx respondents, and also there was no difference among African American respondents. In terms of quality of parks, you can see that overall, 73% rated parks excellent and good. There was a difference between the experience enjoyed by African American respondents, and there was no difference in this case for Latinx respondents. And then 66% of the respondents thought that recreation programs were excellent or good. And again, there were some differential responses among African Americans and Latinx respondents. Quality of yard waste service was rated excellent or good by 65% of the respondents. There was no difference among minority groups in this category. And also everyone agreed, 85% of everyone, I should say, that investing in a healthy community and natural environment was essential. So we had several key accomplishments in health and environment during this fiscal year. And we received a large lead hazard control grant, $5.5 million, which allowed us to keep this program going and expand it. We launched the Community Collaborative on Climate Change, and we analyzed solar feasibility of several city properties, including Butterworth Landfill. We passed a Parks Millage. The residents passed a Parks Millage. That is an evergreen millage that will hold us in good stead for a very long time. And we began work on construction of improvements to our compost site, and that'll be up and running this spring. And we'll be able to start operations in mid-2020, so not too far away from now. We continued to move the biodigestion project forward. We adopted a green infrastructure portfolio standard, and we piloted a park ambassadors program as well. So at this time, I'd like to invite our Stormwater Oversight Chairperson, Stormwater Oversight Commission Chairperson, Elaine Isley, to join the call, along with Stormwater Superintendent Carrie Rivette, to give a report on the work of the Stormwater Oversight Commission.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes. Sound good.
Wonderful. So as Eric mentioned, this is the overview of our annual report for the Stormwater Oversight Commission's activities in 2019. I'm Elaine Isley. I'm the chair of the commission. And I was asked, before I get into it too deeply, to do a quick introduction as to why our role is important. Stormwater runoff is the largest contributor of pollution to our local waterways, and everything we do on the land affects the water quality and sometimes the water quantity, so flooding. And the city has made significant investments over the years in separating the storm sewers from the sanitary sewers. So it's really important to sustain those investments through better stormwater management. And the city has also invested more recently in the implementation of more stormwater green infrastructure that includes things like rain gardens, green roofs, porous asphalt, and tree planters, to name a few, to help capture the stormwater closer to where it falls, keeping less runoff and pollutants out of the Grand River, their tributaries, and ultimately Lake Michigan, which is where we get our drinking water from. So this is the current makeup of the Stormwater Oversight Commission. Actually, I back that up. This is from 2019. We are actually down 2 commissioners from the 3rd Ward. I've been having conversations with some of our neighborhood associations and Commissioner Lanier about how we might be able to get some applicants to fill those positions. But what we do, all of our stormwater activities work toward improving water quality to the Grand, which is part of the city's strategic plan. So this annual report will cover all of the city's stormwater required activities each year, including public education, maintenance, asset management, soil erosion control permits, and many more criteria. And this year, public education continued as part of the Stormwater Asset Management and Wastewater Grant, that's the SAW grant, the Home and Garden Show, El Dia del Nino, green infrastructure tours, and educating stakeholders on the upcoming changes to our municipal separate storm sewer system, MS4 permitting. Okay, next slide. So I realize this is a little hard to read, but since 2016, we have been steadily increasing our investments in stormwater to bring us up to a level of service C. And then we were asked to show this graphically. Thank you, Allison. The operations investments are for inspection and maintenance of the stormwater system, and the capital investments are made up of both investments in stormwater asset management and capital improvement plan and vital streets. Next slide. So in 2019, we did complete the SAW grant. In addition to the condition assessments and tools for staff to make holistic assessments of the stormwater system, we completed substantial work on public education materials, including the Stormwater Rock Watersheds, which is a new song, video, and coloring book, which we are putting in a press release and releasing today. And we're going to try right now to show you a little bit of a clip of the video.
When water comes raining down, it trickles into the ground.
Oh, sorry. Oh. I'm sorry. Are you able to see the video?
We're seeing the video. The sound was a little muddy, but go ahead. It's doing okay.
Okay.
We'll cover land with other things. We'll always run our friends. Live in abundance like the same that that's just trust. Planted in a garden in another house. Hold that soul to keep it up your roots. Water sheds, what can we do to protect them all from leaving? Precious milk don't like to see. Keep them clean for you and me. Water flowing underground. Mother Nature all around. Water sheds, what can we do to protect them all from leaving?
Okay, thanks, Allison. And just so that everyone knows, that was done in partnership. Brian Vander Ark from the Verve Pipe wrote and performed the song for us, and the video was done by Michael Lynn Animation Studios. So, like I said, we'll be releasing that today. And then, all right, so next slide. There we go. So the Vital Streets investments include 27 trees and porous tree grates that were planted at Studio Park. Of all the Vital Streets practices installed in 2019, they'll infiltrate 1.4 million gallons of stormwater each year. Next slide. The strategic plan and green infrastructure portfolio metrics are tracked as part of Vital Streets and for the City Commission Policy 1000-24, which was the green infrastructure portfolio standard that Eric mentioned. Annual gallons infiltrated goal is also part of the strategic plan. Next slide. For capital improvement projects, a significant portion of our capital funds went to the Kent County Drain Commissioner's Office for various work throughout the city. The daylighting inlet modifications at Richmond Pond are complete, and our largest current projects are the 2 bank stabilization projects that will reduce erosion and sedimentation into Plaster Creek. So this pie chart shows the distribution of projects by ward for the fiscal year 21. The undetermined, the blue area, the Kent County Drain Commissioner area, is based on the Drain Commissioner's office projects and emergency needs that we can't attribute to a ward yet. And the second ward looks underrepresented. We do have a large several $1 million project coming for the second ward through the Drain Commissioner's office that is not included in this chart. And then these photographs are of the city's first daylighting project, where underground pipes were turned into a stream at Richmond Park, which was completed in fall of 2019. Our tracking goals toward reaching level of service C In the Eagle reporting year 2019, we continue to meet or exceed all interim inspection goals, with the exception of being 0.3% short on catch basin cleaning. With the SAW grant work, we were able to visually inspect all culverts and televise 45% of them, which was over double our goal. And then preventative maintenance includes cleaning and other minor maintenance needed on stormwater assets. Level of service C goal is to clean 20% of the gravity mains, manholes, and laterals, as well as 25% of catch basins each year. And all of these interim goals were met for 2019. Our greatest policy work last year consisted of working on a credit trading program that can be applied upon issuance of a new MS4 permit. This will aid developers in maintaining compliance with green infrastructure requirements. This was done primarily with Great Lakes Protection Fund grant funds in partnership with American Rivers, the Water Environment Federation, and Corona Environmental. We also made minor revisions to the city's MS4 permit application. And then finally, once Eagle issues the draft permit on our regional watershed group, changes to the stormwater ordinances are expected, and the Stormwater Oversight Commission will provide final recommendations once an agreement is made on the final requirements. And that's all I had.
Thank you, Ms. Isley. Appreciate it. And now we'll move on to report on LED street lighting. And that'll be done by City Engineer Tim Berkman, who will take us through the status report and where we're headed.
All right. Thank you, Mr. DeLong. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I wanted to give you an update on where we're at in phase one, and then also look forward to phase two of this critical infrastructure project. Our phase one bond consisted of $8.8 million that was issued in December of 2018, and that focused on some critical infrastructure upgrades, with a portion of it, approximately 10% of our street lighting, covering some LED conversion. You'll see the flip of that in phase two, where a much heavier investment is on strictly the LED replacements, completing the rest of our streetlights that we have in our system. So under phase one, 16 projects have been awarded. Our 2-year plan is on schedule. We've had to make some adjustments along the way based on project awards. We saw quite a bit of volatility in market pricing due to contractor capacity and workload. Also had some limited electrical engineering resources that we worked through getting these projects to bid. But looking forward, we want to, of course, maintain a focus on our long-term asset management strategy and making sure we're investing in that. We're also going to talk about in a few slides some financing alternatives for phase two of the LED conversion, and also touch on some of our smart city initiatives. So in this slide, you see kind of an overview of the projects that have been included under phase one. At the completion of phase one, all of our primary circuits will have been upgraded to a 3-phase circuit. This will have a common ground, which is much safer to work around. That comprises almost half of this total investment. You see over on the pie chart on the right, the 48%, representing roughly $4.2 million. That work is in construction right now. Approximately half of Circuit West was brought underground. That's the Stocking Bridge and Seward area. Our LED pilot, which consists of 525 lights, was just awarded last month. We'll be getting underway soon. 300 of our 750 concrete poles throughout the city are in the process of being replaced. $1.5 million was invested in connection with Vital Streets projects. Roughly $200,000 was invested in wood pole replacement under that asset management category, where poles were reaching the end of life. 4 crucial overhead primary crossings were replaced, 2 of them over 196, 2 over 131, and that rounds out the almost $8.9 million of investment under phase one. Wanted to touch on, as I mentioned, there has been some LED pilot conversion going on going on under phase one, I should say, as part of the overall infrastructure work. Our high pressure sodium light inventory has all been converted now to LEDs for operation and maintenance. So when the ELC department gets a call that a light is out, they're replacing it with LEDs. 600 lights were replaced as part of a provisional test. This process allowed us to work with manufacturers. So now our fixtures come pre-programmed and are ready to communicate through our FlexNet system. So as an example, once a new light gets plugged in, it automatically reports back to our central database information like when, what date it was installed, the manufacturer, wattage, part, model, serial number, all of that just readily coming back and being reported into our database as it's plugged in. The FlexNet system already communicates, as you know, with Sewer and Water's advanced metering infrastructure. But now the Energy, Lighting, and Communications Department can use that system for noting any real-time outages and have the ability to control on-off and dimming remotely. So as opposed to having to wait through the complaint-based system of folks calling 311 or reporting it via email, now we have that information, or will have that information readily available. And as I mentioned, the LED pilot was just awarded. That's $400,000 project is estimated to be completed at the end of October, and 525 new LEDs will be installed across the 3 wards. This slide goes into our phase 2 program, which we anticipate to kick off in fiscal year 21 and complete at the end of calendar year 2022. Some of our goals is to, of course, convert the remaining LEDs or the remaining lights to LEDs. As I mentioned, we have approximately 18,000 across the city, and the balance of those not already done under phase 1 will be done as part of phase 2. And that's the heaviest part of this investment, totaling almost $8.2 million. I will also be replacing the 450 remaining concrete poles, with 300 of them having been done under phase 1. The Vital Streets partnership will continue, and this one is primarily one main project of division from Fulton to Michigan, where we'll be replacing infrastructure from the 1960s. So the estimated total cost of this bond work would be $12.4 million. And again, as I mentioned, LEDs make up a majority of that, or $8.2 million. The annual debt service for that bond is estimated to be $770,000, of which approximately $500,000 would be allocated to that LED investment. So as you see below, we're more than making that up with our projected annual savings of $540,000 between energy efficiency as well as maintenance savings. So the elimination of electricity consumption will increase renewable energy performance from 37% to 42% just by this work alone. And this slide gives you kind of an overview of the implementation plan. Again, we're anticipating this work will be done over calendar years 21 and 22. We broke it out by quadrants of the city, focusing first of all in the annex area where we have our highest electricity cost reduction potential because we pay higher rates in those areas. But then shifting over to the safe neighborhoods by quadrant, we'll begin the bidding process in September of this year, and then continue with the other quadrants and general areas of the city, finishing up in the downtown with our ornamental and commercial lighting in those areas, practicing balance and distribution along the way. And finally, just kind of giving a recap overview of our implementation plan. Again, finishing out the remainder of the lights not already touched by phase 1, beginning the bid process in September of 2020, where we'll select the most competitive vendors and financing method. What we want to do is evaluate two options. We're prepared to proceed with the work, but look at 2 delivery approaches: the conventional delivery of bond and bid, which we're very familiar with, but also evaluate some energy service company delivery models. And as part of that, we will plan and develop and issue a request for proposals over the July through September timeframe, intentionally timing that with the same track timeline of the standard bid process. And we can evaluate both models based on the best value and life cycle cost overall, as well as the financing tied to it, and really learn from that head-to-head comparison in terms of our path forward. So ready to proceed with phase 2 and continue to support the conversion of LEDs to LEDs, I should say, continuing our partnership with Vital Streets Work and finishing out the concrete pole replacement across the city. And with that, I'll send things back over to Mr. DeLong.
Thank you, Mr. Berkman. And what I'd like to do now is talk about investments that we proposed in the fiscal 2021 budget. So in terms of carbon reduction, climate resiliency, about $9 million with investments that included purchase of compressed natural gas fuel and fleet devices for our fleet, looking at renewable energy credits, the purchase of those, and also the LED streetlights are a major component of this investment category. In terms of green space and recreation, we're working on connecting children to nature through grant-funded opportunity. Obviously, parks maintenance is key. Cemetery mowing is important. Working on our Parks Millage projects, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. We have in the capital budget work at the Martin Luther King Junior Park Lodge, and also Third Ward Park acquisition. And then we'll be working on Hastings Street, the non-motorized pathway there in conjunction with the street projects that are underway. And we will begin design of phase 2 of the Grand River Walkway project. In terms of protecting and preserving water resources, we'll invest $24.33 million. And you can see that the majority of that is in water and sewer projects through our enterprise funds. We'll also continue to do lead service line replacements according to our plan and the stormwater projects that you heard about today from our Stormwater Oversight Commission. We'll work to minimize waste generation and promote diversion. And we'll do much of that through a grant that we have that will help us understand how recycling contamination is happening and how to then address that. We'll reduce health disparities by investing about $2 million in housing lead remediation. And that's funded with a grant that I mentioned earlier today. So now to provide a update on Parks and Recreation, I'd like to invite Parks and Recreation Director David Marquardt to join us.
Thank you, Mr. DeLong. Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioner, City Manager. We are headed into the last year of the 2013 7-year Parks Millage. As a reminder, the current millage covers expenses for park improvement projects and keeping our pools open and operational. Our park projects bridge fiscal years, so you'll see both the 15 projects that will be under construction this season, in addition to the 13 that will undergo community input and design this season as well. We continue to leverage important non-city funds to support the millage projects. This last year alone, roughly $1.1 million was leveraged, with nearly another $1 million projected for this next fiscal year to support our project work. Our FY21 budget still maintains funding to support needed improvements at Martin Luther King Park Lodge, as Eric just mentioned, and funding to help advance the acquisition of needed parkland in the 3rd Ward, as well as neighborhoods of focus. Thanks to voters, the department will begin receiving revenue from the recently adopted and passed November 2019 Evergreen Millage. The department will begin to recognize that revenue in July of 2021, which will be the fiscal 2022 budget. As a reminder, this new millage will support capital projects, park operations, keeping our pools open and operational, as well as enhancing recreational programs. We had the opportunity to share an update with you on park acquisition during the city manager's mid-year update before COVID hit. Since that update, the department has advanced some rather important partnership discussions that should produce the acquisition of 3 new parcels for parks in the 3rd Ward, as well as up to 4 new parcels for parks in our neighborhoods of focus. It's important to note that with these partnerships that are being built, the department is projecting to accomplish these acquisitions at a fraction of the $3.75 million total projected valuations on this page. Next slide. Well, the next fiscal year was planned to be a year of building capacity to ramp up staffing for the start of the new millage in the next fiscal year. We are now projecting this fiscal year to be simply a year of sustaining what we have built over the last 5 years, and this is all a result of the COVID downturn. The new millage guidelines set the maintenance of effort, or the MOE, the MO, calculation looking 1 year back. The result is that we project fiscal year 2025 to be the first year that the MOE, or the maintenance of effort, returns to current levels, fiscal 2020 levels. It's important to note that this really does equate to roughly a $4.2 million negative impact to the park's operating fund over 5 years, as compared to the MOE projections reviewed with leadership back in February of this year. The department was not only asked to reduce expenses to meet the city manager's requested target for reductions, but is also projecting a loss of revenue due to anticipated COVID restrictions on recreational programming. Anticipated program changes include youth and adult sports, leagues, fitness classes, camps, and open swim and swim lessons, and facility rentals. We are proposing solving for these shortfalls through a reduction of temporary and seasonal employees in parks, scaling back recreational programming to meet our new reality, reducing contract work and equipment in forestry, and reducing training and supplies, as well as a reduction in equipment for park maintenance. Parks Advisory Board has been engaged in budget discussions since last November. They approved the millage portions of the budget that were presented to Commission in December, and they received a thorough update of these most recent adjustments at this month's May Advisory Board meeting. So then, given the COVID climate, now the city is proposing to keep all of our outdoor pools and splash pads closed for the summer 2020 season. We have the ability to reevaluate the closure of splash pads further into the summer season if we are seeing changes in the health environment. I think it's worth noting that this recommendation is being made based on guidance from federal, state, and local health professionals. It's also worth noting that numerous other regional recreation providers, both in state and in surrounding states, have already made similar decisions to the one we are recommending here today. And the impact will be a loss of approximately 150 seasonal positions that include lifeguards, pool operations, concessions, and instructors, none of which have yet been onboarded for this work. Expenditures for pool operations are paid for using the 2013 millage fund revenues, a portion of which will still be used to cover our 5-year cycle of pool caulking and painting, which is currently underway. Remaining expenditures are required to be moved to capital millage funds if in fact we do close the pools this season. And the plan at this time is to cover matching grant fund needs for a signature splash pad at Garfield Park, and to cover expenses on deferred capital maintenance projects in our park system like park roads and parking areas. Well, the impact of COVID on recreation is challenging. It is equally so on our local businesses as well. And as a part of the city's COVID recovery discussions, we can begin considering ways in which our parks may offer support to our community and businesses as restrictions and orders are lifted. So as a part of the city's COVID recovery discussions, we will work to be creative in finding new ways to gather for festivals. We are committing to advancing policies that are in the early stages of draft form for private use of parks that can now be advanced. And we intend to accelerate recommendations from the advisory board on approval of a newly drafted smoke-free parks policy, while also considering interim opportunities for sponsored alcohol in parks opportunities. The department has found early success with such models as demonstrated in last year's inaugural Family Paddle Night experience, where Creston Brewery was a sponsor for the alcohol components of that event and that gathering.
Thank you, David. Let's move quickly through the capital update. There were some questions that were asked last time about balance and distribution. I'm going to ask Ms. Sutter if she will come on and walk us through that section real quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you, City Manager. So just a note of clarity in the information that was provided last week, the Division Fire Station had been split between wards 1 and 2, and they should be split between wards 1 and 3. So that minor adjustment has been made in the information presented on this slide. Above the line is showing new graphs with that slight modification made, so you can see the difference between with that correction being made. And this was in consultation with Fire Chief Lehman. The fire station is located in the 1st ward, but he has recommended and explained that the service area provides service to both the 1st ward and to the 3rd ward, hence the split between those two. Just as a reminder from last year for fiscal year 20, some information for the first time was presented on balance and distribution, and that graph is shown here to help reiterate what was done last year. And there was a discussion around outlier projects because there were a number of significant projects that had high value investment in fiscal year 20. There are a couple, the city facilities and street lighting infrastructure are noted in red because for purposes of our continued balance and distribution analysis, those types of projects are identified as citywide and therefore not included in the balance and distribution analysis. So with respect to this slide, I just want to note from the beginning, this is a 6-year analysis. And that's important as we've discussed with asset management planning around the majority of our capital investments. They are long-term investments and there can be variations anytime you look at one single year, but the goal really is to have balance over a longer period of time. So you can see the 3 wards being shown here on the far left. This is fiscal year 20, the same information that was presented on the last slide and how that distribution looked last year. The fiscal year 2020 adjusted is bringing those outlier projects back in to the analysis to make sure that we have a more apples to apples comparison for this year because we did not exclude any outlier projects in this year with respect to our balance and distribution. So the fiscal year 21 to 25 corrected. It's corrected with respect to that Division Fire Station I mentioned. So you can see 35% capital investments taking place in the 2nd and 3rd ward and 30% in the 1st ward. And so then I just want to close with the graph on the far right, again, looking at 6 years of fiscal year 20 through fiscal year 25. You can see that the investment is fairly equal across the 3 different wards. And that's really due to last year there being a heavy investment in wards 1. And so with respect to looking at the more current investments, it looking as if it's more weighted with respect to wards 2 and wards 3. I won't go into the next 2 slides in any detail, but in response to your questions last week, I know you asked for more information with respect to specific capital projects that are planned for each of the wards. So on this first slide, and these are specific to fiscal year 2021, and they are select, but it is the bulk of all of the investments. And then this slide showing Ward 3 investments that are also taking place. And as a part of the packet that the city manager mentioned earlier that was provided to you in response to your questions, there's a full list by ward of all capital projects for all 5 years. It's quite extensive, but wanted to be able to provide that to you so that you can see investments by specific address location and other areas. And that wraps up.
Okay, let's go to the next section. So I'll show again the revenue target slide that we had. As you can see, what we showed today, we've closed the gap a little more, and we're close to what we projected. We have a little bit more work to do. We'll get some additional revenue estimates from the state, I believe, on the 15th. Ms. Claren can confirm that. And we'll be looking at other adjustments that need to be made between now and next week. So we're pretty close. And once we get all that, I would like to have another 5x5 revenue and expenditure forecast looking at balance and see how that projects, especially when we get the new revenue. Next slide, please. So we are at the point now where we'll entertain any questions that the commission has. We'll continue to follow up on any questions that we might not be able to address today. And if you can get those to us by next Thursday, we'll be prepared for, by this Thursday rather, we'll be prepared for the briefing next week and provide those responses at subsequent work session. So again, I want to thank all of the staff and presenters today. They've done an outstanding job sharing the material and a little relief from the cartoon. These are tense times, but we are required to do education as part of our permit. So I want to thank them for that. And with that, Mayor, I'll turn it over to you and see if you want to take a break before we start going through each section one by one.
All right, thanks. Commissioners, would you like a break or are you prepared to move forward? You have preference? I see keep going. Okay. All right. So let's just keep going then. If you need a break, you can, I think Commissioner Lanier might want a break.
No, I was just teasing Commissioner Jones, who had his lunch off screen, that maybe some of us need a break, but that's okay.
All right. So let's jump in. I'll start. I have several questions. I'll start with a few and then I'll turn it to I'll start with my first question is related to slide 18. I am curious from our city clerk, the reduction that is being proposed there. I just want confirmation that that's not going to have any impact on our upcoming elections, knowing that those are key and also the need to make sure that we're communicating that people can vote by mail and vote absentee. So that's one question I have. Another question, and this maybe not a question, but perhaps a follow-up. I would like some more detail on how it's going with the higher reach pilot. And I'm curious what changes were made where they're still consistent with the fidelity of the model. And then if we've started to see an impact on hiring due to that program and being a part of that work. I have several questions about parks, so maybe I will save those until commissioners have an opportunity to ask additional questions on this portion. Yeah, so why don't I start with up and then I'll come back because I have quite a few questions about parks.
Mayor, just to confirm, so we're going one section at a time, connected and engaged first?
Yeah, why don't we do that? So my question related to maybe the city clerk can answer the question about elections and the $25,000 reduction. And then Mr. Matthews, you can provide additional information on higher reach now or just send that to the full commission in writing.
Yeah, we'll put together with the information.
Okay, thanks.
Just briefly on mine, we did have initially in the budget for redoing some of the e-poll book laptop computers so that we're going to see if we can get another election cycle out of them. And then also, since we're not traveling and having, since some of the main conference for IIMC is in Grand Rapids, they won't have those travel costs. So some of our fees are down for that too. And also for communications, we kind of scaled back. We increased what we did for community promotions. We were going to increase it more, but we kind of scaled it back. But there's some different things that we can do, social media, and hopefully with leveraging what the state's doing as far as elections. That it's going to be. I'm actually having a phone call with the Secretary of State. It looks like next week to talk about those things.
Great, thank you. All right, commissioners, I'll open it up to you for questions on the first section. So that would be going through slide 29. So any other questions on that first section? Commissioner Assassi?
Bingo, sorry, I was muted. Thanks for the presentation. I too had a question about the clerk's office, so thank you for that, Mayor. Mr. Matthews, could you talk a little bit about, we talked about some of the expanded services around translation and support for our meetings to make sure primarily Spanish language individuals are able to be engaged that way. Do we have any numbers about how many people utilize those services at our commission meetings? That's something that I would be interested in knowing. And if you don't have the number now, you can follow up.
I would be guessing if I gave you the number now, just based observationally, but that's something that we can bring back. I do think, and this is also based on my experience, that the participation increases over the time that you provide the service, because folks start to realize that A, it's available, but B, that it actually works. But yeah, we'll see if we can get some specific numbers. We've also done some things on the back end to daylight some of the things that we're doing. One of the things that we noted was that, for instance, we had the Spanish language commission meeting. We had on a separate Spanish language channel, but it wasn't linked to our main YouTube channel. So the only way you could get to it is if you knew that there was a Spanish language channel and you found it. So we've shortened that distance by making it available on the main channel and linking out. So we're also trying to integrate a lot of the things that we're doing so that there's multiple points of access and people understand the availability of those services.
I had another follow-up question for you, Mr. Matthews. I know that during this time, we've talked quite a bit about, obviously, our external communications and had a number of updates. But I know one of the things that the city also did was to have a hotline for employees to be able to call to get sort of those updates. I wonder if that's being utilized and, the success around that.
I can find out.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for me for right now.
Great. Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioners, any other questions on that first section? All right, Commissioner Lanier.
Just a quick one. I think it's for Mr. Matthews. On slide 29, you mentioned the governor's work share program that she shared in a call last week, and that if the city were interested in participating in that it would require some conversations with our bargaining units. And so I'm curious to know if we've had any preliminary discussions with them.
We have labor relations had some discussions with them towards the end of last week, and we actually had a follow-up conversation with a couple of them today, specifically to learn their questions and concerns about implementation of such a program. And so we're actively working with them to come up with something that meets, I think, what are shared goals, which is one, we don't want employees to be adversely impacted. And two, we want to avoid as best we can services to the community being adversely impacted. So we're not sure where it's going to go just yet, but it's an active conversation.
Great, thank you.
Let me thank you, Mr. Matthews, for that follow-up in the conversation that we have with the union. And just to clarify, we've not spoken to all of our bargaining units, only the non-sworn ones, because I have no intent of making those change in staffing models on public safety. So it's been primarily for non-sworn, if we can target non-essential staff that's unable to be productive in telecommuting or even doing on-site work. So that's been the extent of the conversation so far.
Thank you. Great, thanks. Commissioner Jones?
Madam Mayor. Yeah, I have a question.
Yep. Go ahead, Commissioner Moody.
On, I think it's slide 9, page 9, whatever. There is something that was brought up in reference to creating pathways to financial growth for residents. How is that going to work? What type of thought has been put into it? I did not hear that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
See, Mayor's not just unlike. See,
on page 9, there is you talked about, I don't know if it was you, but I think you talked about creating a pathway to financial growth for residents. I need to know how is that? Has that been some thought as to how that's going to work?
Well, that's a big question. That creating pathways to financial growth is one of the core objectives for the strategic plan. So,
Yes.
we have the strategies outlined within the plan that were talked about last year when we adopted the plan. But
Yes.
if you want to talk about it specifically in the context of where we are right now,
Yes.
with the response to COVID, we have a whole separate team of individuals that are developing a framework for how we can support affected individuals, but also hopefully use this opportunity to do just that, to not just stand people up where they're at, but point them in a direction, and create those opportunities for growth, utilizing some of the additional funding sources. And if that's a conversation that we want to have, Mark, I mean, that's something that I know Eric can probably speak a little bit more specifically to where we are with the objectives.
I think you covered it well. It's tied into our economic prosperity and affordability effort, where either we're talking about resiliency for the individual, and as we reviewed last week, and what we can do to support people with basic necessities around the quality of life, or supporting businesses, and whether that is relief and recovery assistance, or as we even help with the third ward equity program, some of the programming that we've done within that. So those are the kind of things, small business development, using our collaboration with the Chamber and DGRI for business support and technical assistance, and doing some things we're doing right now, even working with the Right Place and some of our other partners around creating more awareness around some of the assistance that's available even outside of the city. So it's a combination.
So, Mark, just one last question. Where does the 83% come?
And I think that is the survey response, where people thought that this was one of the most essential areas. That was based on and I can't remember the number of people that participated in the survey. City Manager Matthews can help me, but that was just one of the highest areas of responses that indicate how important that was to people. So feeling safe, being healthy, having good pathways for educational growth, as well as financial pathways, which basically says it aligns with our strategic priorities.
Right. And the 83% is 83% of the 400 respondents said that was essential or very important in terms of prioritizing for the plan.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's the number I was looking for.
Thank you. Thanks, Commissioner Moody. So why don't we go to Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question or request to Mr. Matthews. The number that you included regarding early retirement incentive up to $7.7 million in operations. Can you do me the favor of just not now, but in the near future, can you just remind me of how many of our city staff are eligible for retirement? I'd like to, because I know that we've talked about that number before in terms of looking at the how the city's workforce is going to change, and based on those who are eligible. I just can't recall that number. So
were you interested in the number that are presently eligible, or the number that would be eligible under a early retirement incentive?
Both.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions on this section, Commissioners? All right, so let's go ahead and move to the second section on health and environment. I'll kick it off with a few questions that I have specifically to parks. So I have a number of questions. I saw, or at least, I don't know if I saw it in here or David alluded to cuts in the forestry department. I'm curious about some more detail related to forestry. I know this commission supported allocating additional money to get caught up on responding to dangerous trees, both dead trees and dying trees. So I'm curious where we are in that work. And if we're cutting back forestry significantly, I have a concern that we're just going to go backwards when we still have a lot of needs throughout our city. So that's one question. My second question related to park acquisition. I'm curious if we are planning and ready to submit applications to MDNR Trust Fund, knowing that they have funds available that can pay for up to 70% of park acquisition. And then I'm pretty concerned about the slide number 63 around the maintenance of effort. Having been a part of both parks millages, one thing we heard loud and clear from the community is that they were weary of supporting a parks millage if that meant that the city was just going to reduce their general fund support, that they didn't want to support money for parks and then just have the city fill a hole and move those dollars, which is why we came up with the guidelines. So I appreciate looking back just 1 year. But if that means that anytime there's a reduction, it's going to take us 4 to 5 years to catch back up, I don't think that was the spirit of the guidelines when those were put into place. And so I have some concerns about that, especially if it equates to over a $4 million reduction over 5 years. And if that means we need to revisit those guidelines, those were created by the City Commission, and I'm happy to review those. But having been a part of those conversations, that I don't believe that that was the intent of the guidelines, to see that kind of dramatic reduction over several years because of 1 year of a potential economic downturn. So I'll stop there. I have other questions related to parks, but I think those are my 3 big ones.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. If you don't mind, let's work backwards. We'll start with the parks millage question, then the park acquisition, and then address the forestry question. I just want to clarify, and perhaps Ms. Claren and Mr. DeLong can also help, that the slide on slide 63, and I don't have the comparative slide, but I think, as I recall, our ability for the general fund, not just the park operating maintenance fund, but the general fund in totality, to get back to pre-COVID levels also took an equal amount of time for restoration. So as I recall the projection on the 5x5, the general fund, it specifically also took some time for us to recover the pre-COVID levels. Is that correct, Ms. Claren?
Yeah, I would say the decrease in the MO is just reflective of what's going on in the entire system right now. We could, if it helps to see the total contingent of funding for the Parks Department, we could show you the MO as well as the projected millage dollars over time, just so you can see what the total investment is, because the millage dollars we expect to be a lot more constant, not as affected by the COVID pandemic as, what's going on in the general fund. But again, the guidelines were drafted in the spirit of, well, not in the spirit, but they rise and decrease as the general fund's funding, expands or contracts.
Thanks, Molly. I would like to see a little bit more detail, especially because we went back and we asked for an increase from 0.98 to 1.25, asking residents to pay more, and then to see that our general fund support for maintenance of effort is going to go down over 4 years as we ask residents to pay more for a millage. And granted, this was before COVID, and I fully appreciate that, but I'd like to better understand where those numbers are coming from. And so if I could get some additional detail, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I will add, with that calculation we do to determine what the MO is, the Parks Department does have a carved out section of pie that does remain constant. So they're not losing any percentage share of that general fund dollars, that share of the pot of money. So you can be assured of that. But yeah, we can provide more detail.
And when we do, Ms. Claren, let's do it holistically, because what we'll see, it's not just for the parks millage, but the library millage will be the same. Those millages will have more constant funding, because the prediction about the economic impact does not affect property values and special assessments in the same way it does
with the general fund, which, as you know, is very dependent on income, which has a little bit more volatility. So let's do it holistically. Let's certainly answer the question related to parks millage, but just show how that comparative outcome has similar effects on other revenue sources as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's go to the next question about park acquisition and our conversations about the MBR trust fund, and that was something that was mentioned previously, and we have followed up. And so I'm going to ask Mr. Marquardt or Mr. DeLong to give an update on at least our preliminary discussions internally, as well as what discussions
So
we've.
I'll start in, Mr. Marquardt can amplify it. So yes, we do intend to seek grant funding. The cycle for the current year is done. So we'll be looking forward to the next cycle, which will work out pretty well because that's when we will have amassed the match money. So we've had conversations with trust fund representatives, and I think that the kinds of things we would be applying for will be competitive. So Ben David did mention during his presentation that we were and we would be seeking these grant funds, and not just from trust fund. We would be seeking other types of support as well.
David, anything else to add, or you just dropped the mic on us there?
Yep, no, sorry. I'm waiting for some truck traffic to roll by my window down here at 201. It gets a little noisy. Eric is exactly right. We do intend to seek MD&R trust fund grants to support this work. But I think more importantly, with the plan that we are putting together right now, we are working through some really important relationships deliver for us, as mentioned in the presentation, some of these acquisitions at a fraction of the cost that we are projecting for land valuation.
Great, thanks.
Okay, then David, you can keep your camera and mic on. Let's go to the last question about the reduction in forestry.
Yeah, so a bulk of the work that has been accomplished already with the forestry priority work has been our priority one work. We are nearly complete with all of that priority one work, which mostly included removal of hazardous trees throughout the system, both on our street system and within our park system and cemeteries. A lot of that work has been done. We've noticed a significant reduction in storm damage. The tornado that we experienced last season, with the event that we had last winter as well, we were noticing a significant decline in some of those hazardous trees and limbs that would have otherwise been coming down. So we've made great progress there. There is no doubt that the reductions are concerning in that we will be essentially slowing the pace of work at which we've been moving along currently. And as we now move into priority two work, we need to be cognizant of that, no doubt. And with the reductions that we are projecting in this proposed budget, I would anticipate roughly a 25% reduction in the work that we would have otherwise been progressing on.
Okay. All right, and perhaps we can also follow up with a little bit more detail on the relative fiscal impact of that compared to the regular operations. I too share the concern, Mayor, that you shared earlier, but none of these decisions are easy. All of them are tough decisions, and if we put that back in, then we'll have to cut somewhere else, and we certainly can do that. But it's not. Or then we as you see, we still have a ways to go on the general fund. We have about another $700,000 of reductions to do in addition to what we shared today.
All right, commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Sassi?
Thank you, Mayor. David, could you talk a little bit? I'm on slide 66, and maybe this is for you too, City Manager. Last summer, we talked quite a bit. Many of us were in Joe Taylor Park after an increase of violence in our community, particularly gun violence. And we talked about how we really wanted our neighborhood parks to be part of the solution to reduce that violence. And just kind of recognizing one of the first bullet point about how we might support the community and businesses reopening. I know last year GRPS, through partnership was doing some additional patrols of our parks. I know that they're also going to be in the same place that we are experiencing reductions from the state. So is there an update about as we get towards, it doesn't seem very warm right now, but as we get towards these warmer months and, other things keep happening in this city outside of COVID, what are the thoughts about how parks, the role that parks play in the reduction of particularly gun violence in our community?
Yeah, I'll defer first to David, and then I'll share my thoughts after.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, City Manager. As a part of our budget package that we proposed this year, we did include a request of some supplemental funding to continue the pilot program of park ambassadors that we advanced last year rather quickly. We thought that was a good program. I think the city manager and his leadership team agree with that. And we've been working together with the city manager's office to see if there might be a way in which to continue that this year. As you can see, we've got significant challenges across the entire organization. And so I'm not sure that we'll be able to advance that program this year, but I'll let the city manager maybe explain a little bit more.
Yeah, I think when we looked at it, our thoughts were if the parks are closed, and as they are now, then that is a savings without the expense of having the ambassador program. So as long as the stay-at-home order is as restrictive as it is, it doesn't make a lot of, not as much sense as it once did to have those ambassadors on program, particularly if we have the opportunity now to reassign city staff in certain areas, and we've certainly done that in other operations. So that was some of the thought. If we are able to increase the recreation aspects of our park operations, then of course we'll have to staff up accordingly. But I think the projections that we've had, similar to pools, that there's going to be limited utilization of pools. We know that there are people out in the parks, but again, right now we have not permitted the use of some of those other amenities that may have caused more people to congregate in the park. And if we loosen that up as the summer goes along, then yes, we'll have to reevaluate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think that's a good question. I anticipate that, at least what I've seen when I'm out in the parks, I see more utilization today than typical. My guess is that come summer, we're going to continue to see pretty heavy utilization of outside spaces. So we may need to really think about that. Okay, Commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Repart?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I just want to share a couple of thoughts. First of all, I echo the mayor's question on maintenance of effort. I look forward to seeing that. I know that in the guidelines, it says that we'll take a look back when determining that. And this year is going to be an outlier year in some ways. And so I just want us to be open to whether or not we need to adjust that but having all the information is going to help us to be able to decide what we need to do with that. I do want to say that I'm super pleased that Garfield Park splash pads are going to get done based on that. And which leads me to, another question is for David is, how is this going to affect our commitment, our partnership, our agreements with Friends of Grand Rapids Parks? I know that they were going to pick that up and we're going to do that. So now they don't have to, but I know that one of the things that we've agreed to work with them on is volunteer coordination, which is a huge add to our parks. So I just wanted to ask the question about that. And I guess my last question is, where where does lead fall? Is it under health and environment? Is it under equity? I just want to say one more lead thing before we're done with this
Yeah.
budget conversation.
I think you can make, health and environment would be appropriate.
Okay. Because I just, I know that Ms. Bohach said in our meeting last week, obviously inspectors are not going to be able to get into homes for some time, but I felt like we were making some pretty good progress on a potential pilot in 49507. Wondering if, even if we can, and perhaps it's in our partnership with the county and it's on our ask to them, but would still really like to see something preserved in terms of forward progress for a lead pilot. I don't think that it has to be super expensive, but I think that having something in the budget demonstrates our willingness and dedication to following through on the recommendations of that task force. And so, as far as I know, right now, the only things in the budget are the implementing the grants that we have, unless there's a restructuring or pivoting. But I'd love to hear, as a part of the final pitch to us about the budget, what we're able to accomplish or not based on the budget being presented around lead.
All right, let's if we could begin with the first questions, Mr. Marquardt, about the park operations, and then we'll address the lead questions.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Rephart, for your question and your enthusiasm for the Garfield Park Splash Pad. That is a project that the department received a $300,000 MDNR trust fund grant for the construction of a signature splash pad in that part of our city, which we are very excited about. Because of the challenges of COVID, the Friends organization did indicate that fundraising may be a challenge moving forward. And so we did suggest that if we are, as we have proposed here today, potentially keeping our pools closed for the summer, that is funding that remains in the millage fund that has to be moved over to capital projects, park projects. So we've indicated to Friends early on here that we could potentially move some of those funds over to support that matching requirement for the MDNR grant to move that project forward. So everything should be good in that stead. With regards to reductions, we did have to make reductions to every one of the line items in our budget in order to meet our targets and to meet anticipated revenue reductions. And one of those line items was a contract with Friends. That funding was intended to be used for a number of things, which included tree watering, tree planting, tree pruning, and a portion of support for their volunteer coordinator. The executive director and I have talked about how those funds could be allocated, and we are open to where those funds are used in their organization to best match their need, while also still supporting the needs that we had outlined together.
Okay. And before we go on to the next question, I just want to again, Mr. Marquardt, keep your camera on. Just again reemphasize for the commissioners this process of adjusting for COVID has required us all to step back and think of how we deliver services differently and creatively. And just because something is said to not have been funded in the same way in the budget does not necessarily mean it will not be a alternative way of addressing that issue. And so I go back to the ambassador program and just to reassure the commissioners that the way our contracts are, before we reduce permanent staffing, we have to reduce temporary staffing. And just because we reduce temporary staffing does not mean there is not staff that we have to assign to other essential functions. So we'll go back and try to make sure that we have an operations plan that lets us address that need regarding the ambassador program and keeping the community safe. Anything else on either of those issues, Mr. Marquardt, before we move on? Okay.
Nope.
All right. Then on the lead issue, see Mr. DeLong is on. Is Ms. Bohatch on?
She is, I believe. So
Yes, I'm here.
if you'd like, I can get started and then Connie can follow up. And we can provide more detail in a follow-up if we need to. So in terms of the lead hazard grant, of course, with the we're not able to go into people's homes, and so that part of it's been closed down, and we're not accepting any applications. But then, with the reentry order that we're about to issue after June 1, we may begin accepting applications again for the regular lead hazard program. And then the pilot at the last meeting, Ms. Bahaj talked about the idea of using to do the lead testing with using the swipe method, and that on a pilot basis. And pre-COVID, there was a shortage of contractors, and we're wondering about the availability of contractors post-COVID. So Connie can provide amplification, but that's where we are right now, and we have not given up on the pilot. We intend to find a way to do it, but that's the status of the Connie?
Yeah, I think Eric.
If you're not speaking, their mics on mute, please. There you go.
Thank you. Eric sums it up, I think, quite well, that we obviously have our federal programs that we are able to begin implementation as soon as we are able to get back into folks' homes. We do have some projects in the pipeline right now that we can get started with, but we will have to ramp back up starting June 1, if that is the date that's decided for us to be able to return to work, where we'll start taking applications again. We are soon to be releasing a lead-based paint risk assessment, assessors RFP for our housing rehabilitation programs that will give us some indication of local capacity currently. That will also then be able to help us determine what more we might need to do in order to build capacity to move forward with inspection in terms of rental properties and have access to contractors in terms of whether we need to do some support for business development and or just individuals to be trained to enhance capacity of current businesses to do that work. But again, our recommended approach is not to use our code compliance staff to do that work, but sort of a hybrid model from some of those that we've looked at, which is Rochester, New York, and others, and other communities, to create our own approach that we think is beneficial in our community, that really then reduces some costs for the city long-term, as well as creates economic opportunity for individuals in our community. So we're looking at it more of a hybrid approach. I'm not giving up on it, as Eric indicated, but it may just take us a little longer in the year to get it going.
All right, thank you, Connie. I echo Commissioner Park's comments and would like to see a plan to move forward with that pilot as soon as we are able. Yeah, I have two follow-up questions. One, in follow-up to what Commissioner Asasi said about the ambassador program. I know we also in the past couple of years have employed youth for green teams. And again, you know, thinking about our partnerships, they are able to stretch dollars because we're partnering. So even with the green team, we offset the cost of a portion of those wages through our LEAD program. And so I'm just curious if our intent, if we're able to open back up parks, if we also plan to move forward with some semblance of green teams and youth employment this summer. So that's one question. And then my second question, City Manager, is there's a lot of advocacy going on right now, both to secure funding from the federal government directly for cities, but then also, you know, we're actively working to request funds through the county through their CARES Act allocation. if we're able to secure funds from either of those sources, is the intent to revisit some of these proposed cuts and then put the funding back in for some of these services?
I want to be careful. I chose not to use COVID funding to CARES funding to just replace or support operational programs, but if we can show that they are directly tied to recovery, economic recovery, like employing people, we'll be able to do that. Can anybody hear me? I can't hear you.
City manager, what's
City
your handle?
manager, city manager, this is Molly. It might be a city hall bandwidth issue. I'm wondering, can you guys?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
I wonder if we have too many.
Yeah, it's not the best response.
Yeah.
A lot of feedback.
We looked into this earlier. I was sure it wasn't a city hall issue.
This is Molly. Can you guys hear me clearly?
Yeah, well, you're
Yes, yes, hear you clearly, Molly.
too many people on, maybe, or
Yeah, it seems to occur a lot with City Hall. I'm wondering if it's our bandwidth issue or something. We can definitely look into it. What the city manager, I think, was starting to say is we have to be careful with the CARES funding, things like that, because we don't want to get in a problem with supplanting current programs. So there is a fine line of what we can use some of these dollars for. We'll definitely, take that under consideration, though. We'll probably.
Mayor, let me.
I recognize the limitations with the CARES funding through the county, and I've read the eligibility related to that. But if we get direct funding from the federal government in this next relief package, that will be able to be utilized to offset revenue reductions based on reductions in income tax, sales tax, and other types of reductions.
Correct.
Yeah, if that's approved, but what we've applied for is things, I think we creatively identify things that would help in recovery. Job creation is one. So yes, if we're able to create jobs particularly for people who've been adversely affected, we may be able to creatively find ways to use some of these programs in the parks. Regarding our staffing, right now we are focusing on essential staffing. But if there is a need, an essential need, we'll find a way to staff. So if parks are utilized more frequently and there's a need for it, we will find a way to staff. But right now, with the economic slowdown, there are not supposed to be anybody gathering, playing at this point. David, correct me, but we have all of our amenities, basketball, tennis, all of those amenities are closed. Is that correct?
That's correct, City Manager, and they will remain closed at least through the end of this month with the stay-home orders.
Right. And our other amenities, for the most part, in the parks, everything's closed except just accessing park land and trails, and they're not supposed to be gathering and congregating in those areas, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So if we start to have more permissive use of the parks, then yes, we will staff up accordingly to meet these essential needs.
All right, commissioners, other questions related to any of the additional information provided on Capitol or LED lights or parks? Commissioner Lanier?
Okay, there I go. Thanks, Mayor. I just have two questions. Since we're talking about parks, I'll quickly ask that question first. I think this is a great opportunity for us to focus on park maintenance. I know that I think the mayor mentioned this earlier, that had been raised as a concern as we were renewing the millage. And so I wonder if there's a way, because people aren't expected to be in the parks, and because the governor has lifted construction, for us to do some of the park maintenance. I know each year, I annually receive emails and phone calls about specific parks and, beehives and, you know, in the dugout of a baseball diamond and things of that nature. So, and that happens almost annually. And so I wonder if there's a way for us to spend some time thinking about the maintenance that could be done in light of this opportunity before the parks are open, hopefully in June. And then the second question is in the email that we received a couple hours ago was the response to the question about the bus shelters, and there was a map of the locations, of all of those shelters. And I'm just curious if there's a key that goes along with the map. So there are dots on the map, but it would be great if we knew, like, cross streets or something where, you know, to know exactly where those dots are, because it's not a large map where you can kind of see street names.
Thank you, Commissioner. We can follow up and get more detail on the mapping. On the parks question, I want to follow up and make sure I'm clear. Your suggestion about maintenance is not routine maintenance, such as cleaning. Your question's around capital improvements type of projects in the parks?
No, I think more routine. I think sometimes because they're utilized so frequently, it's really hard to do kind of an in-depth maintenance on a park, because the minute school is out, the parks are, you know, in full swing with sports and things of that nature. And because we have an opportunity this year, in light of the closures, I wonder if we could do some of the things that we couldn't typically do because we have people always in those parks. So kind of more routine, but maybe a more thorough routine maintenance is kind of what I'm thinking. Like a spring cleaning, if you will, that you do at home, you know, that you wouldn't do weekly, but you do that kind of annually.
Perhaps Mr. Marquardt can talk a little bit. He gave the example of what we're planning to do with the splash pads, even though they're closed. But are there any other examples of maintenance things that you think we could take advantage of during this time, Mr. Marquardt?
Yes, most certainly. And Commissioner, appreciate the question and appreciate that thought. There is no doubt that right now in this interim and rather unprecedented time that we do have an opportunity to begin addressing some things that normally would otherwise be forgotten about. We are not running around right now and inspecting playgrounds. They're closed. Same thing with many of our amenities, but it is giving our staff, at least in a short window here that we've got while things are still closed, to begin addressing some maintenance components that they have otherwise not been able to get to, fixing park benches, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So in the short term, yes, there are some things that we are doing currently and will continue to do in this time of closure. We'll have to reevaluate as things open back up and we begin operating in our new reality.
Thank you.
Well, and I'll just add, you know, for me, this also goes back to the question though about volunteers. That there's still a lot of opportunity to utilize volunteers safely, whether it's for pruning or for painting or for park beautification. And so I hope we're also, and again, as I recall, this was one of the conversations we had years ago when we established our partnerships in the community. You know, I don't necessarily think that those should be forgotten either, because I still think there's a lot of things that we can do safely, and people are still out volunteering. All right, how's that? Maybe it is City Hall.
I think everybody's afraid to speak now.
I just quickly about lead. Now I feel like I'm getting the same feedback. Okay, it's gone. I know that when we talked about lead, maybe last week or the week or the time before, there had been some communication about relaunching the lead awareness campaign. And I was just curious if that's still the case, I want to make sure that I'm understanding that correctly. And then if so, because I do think that families are spending a lot of time, in their homes, tipping paint and painting and outdoors and things of that nature. And it would be great to have that campaign happening now and that interactive website that was in place before, I think, with 311 support, so that as families are kind of doing their own DIY projects, that they have that awareness happening at the same time.
Yeah, we do have funding looking forward into FY21. I saw Amy's face pop up for just a millisecond up there. I don't know, Amy, if you want to speak a little bit to where we are.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that question, Commissioner Lanier. So I know our Community Development Department has additional funding, that grant funding, that just before COVID-19 hit, Aaron and I had talked about that, what that can look like, because as you know, we wanted to do a 2.0, a Don't Play Around 2.0. And so in last week's video message, the mayor and city manager did sort of reintroduce the lead awareness campaign to our community, and reminded folks that we do have the don'tplayaround.org website where they can do that self-assessment. They can go through their home, they can take a look at the various rooms in their home and sort of self-identify where some of those hidden dangers of lead may be. And then, of course, the website provides a ton of resources where folks can go, whether they're in the city or not. Healthy Homes Coalition is another great resource for folks who are needing information and what to do if they're worried about lead in their home. So in our upcoming GR Connected, which will come out, we're doing it twice a month now, which I'm really excited about, but we will have additional information. So throughout the spring and summer, we will continue to not only push out the already created PSAs, but look for opportunities to create more. And I know we had really wanted to focus as part of 2.0 on the DIYers, the do-it-yourselfers. And so that most certainly will be part of the messaging as well.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Great, thanks. Commissioners, any other questions? All right, seeing none. City Manager, anything else before we finish up?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. You look like you're in a basement.
I'm in a very secret place. No, thank you. I apologize for the technical difficulties. We did assess this before and thought it was not a city hall issue, but we'll reassess definitely before next week to see what we can find out with all the interference that we've had, disruption that we've had today. But thank you for your diligence and patience. I think you've given us some real good, important things to think about and follow up on, and we will endeavor to do so by next week. Again, I think, Ms. Clarence, can you remind us of what we might potentially learn from the meeting with the state on the 15th?
So on Friday, the state releases revenue estimates for us. That particularly means the revenue sharing. We already reduced that by $2 million. We'll see what that means for if it's great enough where we would have to make another budgetary adjustment. So I'm hoping me and the city manager would be able to notify you of that early next week, just so you're aware of what's going on, because there's a lot going on just for our governing body next week with public hearing and our proposed adoption date on the 21st.
Okay, thank you. Again, if there are questions, please feel free to contact us. Certainly email us your questions. We appreciate that. That's been very helpful And we'll do our best to get our responses back to you.
All right, thank you, City Manager. Thank you all of the city staff who presented and pulled together this information for us. And I will see you all back here tonight at 7 p.m. Hopefully we won't have as many technical difficulties. All right, with that.
I'm gonna call in from home this evening.
Yeah, all right, you can try that. I'll be here at City Hall. City Clerk, any final thing before I close this session?
No, I think we're all set, ready for tonight.
Okay. All right, everyone. See you at 7.